Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we'll be reviewing APUSH Unit 2. So the time period for this unit is from 1607 to 1754. So first we'll be focusing on all the different types of colonizers. So the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the British, and what their goals were. So first off, the Spanish goals were wealth, of course. Minerals like gold and silver, then cash crops, which caused them to impose the encomienda system, which basically made Native Americans into slave labor. But then they changed to the hacienda system because people in Spain were talking about how brutal it was. Also, the monarchs didn't like how powerful the Spaniards were getting. It was still a labor system though, but it focused more on agriculture. Like in the encomienda system, Spaniards didn't own the actual land of plot, but in the hacienda system, they did own the plot, while the indigenous laborers were in like a debt repayment system to the land. So, the Spanish developed social systems to meet their labor needs and to consolidate their control over indigenous people, primarily for wealth and power. Another goal was to convert them to Christianity. They established missions throughout America to organize Catholic churches into towns as the main center. As we said in the previous video, many indigenous people did incorporate some Christian practices into their indigenous practices, which is called syncretism, but it was still not good enough in the Spanish eyes, so they continued to further and try to suppress their indigenous beliefs and traditions. Many indigenous resisted this force though, such as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. They killed hundreds of Spaniards, about 400, and drove out about 2,000 of them, and they destroyed churches and reestablished their own cultural customs. Also, as established in the previous video, was the Spanish created the caste system, which was a social hierarchy based on race. Moving on to the French and Dutch, their goals were very similar. They first off had fewer colonists in the New World, as they rather built many trading posts. They were more cooperative with the native populations. The French goals wasn't to establish permanent settlements like the Spanish and British, but rather gaining wealth through trade, such as the fur trade. So, many allied and intermarried with natives to improve trade relations. French did send missionaries like the Spanish, but they really weren't like as brutal. Like they didn't really care that much. The Dutch, of course, also focused on trade as well. They established the colony of New Amsterdam, which became a significant trading port that attracted merchants all over. Like some people were saying like they could hear like a dozen different languages there. Now, moving on to the British goals. So, compared to other European powers, many came from Great Britain to settle in North America. One of the reasons why was social mobility, which means the ability to change your social or economic status. So, many people felt limited due to the English primogeniture laws. No idea how to pronounce that, sorry. Which basically means only the oldest son could inherit family land. So many younger sons saw the New World as a new opportunity for new possibilities. Also, of course, economic prosperity. Like the British first colony established was Jamestown in 1607, and it was mostly populated by young, gold-seeking men. They focused more on gold rather than agriculture, which led many of them to starve. Plus, they didn't really find like that much gold. So then the colony started to plant tobacco. That wealth began flowing. Also, another reason was religious freedom, as there was a bunch of religion drama going on in England as they were going from the change from Catholic Christianity to Protestant Christianity. So this formed two major groups. One, the Puritans. They want to stay in England and change the Church of England, while the Separatists, became known as the Pilgrims, believed that the Church of England was past saving and they must separate themselves. Also, since, church and politics were they weren't separate, King James I, also the head of the church, was very angry. So this led groups to leave and go to the New World for religious freedom. Also, they went for improved living conditions. During this time in England, it was experiencing significant population growth, and there was many poor farmers faced because of the enclosure movement, which enabled wealthy landowners to claim public lands, which was previously reserved to poor farmers to graze land for their livestock. So, because of all this, there was many poor people who came to the New World for better living conditions and opportunities. So basically, to sum this up, the Spain focused on power, wealth, and control. They were very brutal and wanted to convert them all and take over everything. But the French and Dutch were more cooperative and focused on wealth, but using trade. British just wanted to shove the New World away and have their own New World, and want to live separate from the indigenous people, also economic reasons. So, furthermore, moving on, focusing on the British, by the end of 1754, there were 13 distinct British colonies in the eastern coast of North America. So, at the top was the New England region, settled by pilgrims, as mentioned earlier, for religious freedom. In 1620, the Plymouth colony was established, and people emigrated there as whole family groups, and they set out to create a new society. They established the Mayflower Compact, which was a simple majority rule government, which was low-key democratic style of governing for this time. They also adopted agriculture as well, but they also had long winters, so because of climate and geography, it wasn't consistent, so they implemented the subsistence farming, which only grew what they needed to survive. 10 years later, 1,000 Puritans left England and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony as well. Very similar to Plymouth, all free property-owning men could vote on policy, which was a larger proportion than back in England. They also debated policies in town hall meetings. Again, majority win. But only Puritans were free men. So, even though they came for religious freedom, here you can't be any other religion besides what the Puritans believe. Anyways, low-key hypocritical. But then, later, the Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony merged into one single colony. And since environment made large-scale agriculture difficult, they began to create an export economy based on fur, timber, and fish. Now, moving on to the middle colonies, such as New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. There was lots of diversity, so they also had religious tolerance. So in New York, they had lots of seaports and rivers and fertile soil, so their purpose was economic and export of grain. Pennsylvania, created by William Penn, had lots of religious tolerance. Penn was actually a Quaker, so in England, he would have been persecuted for his beliefs. And also, Pennsylvania was low-key democratic. Decisions were also made by a representative assembly chosen by landowners. Low-key, they also treated the indigenous kind of fairly. So, this area attracted lots of diversity. Moving down to the Chesapeake and North Carolina region, Jamestown was the first British colony, then became the Virginia colony, and their main goal was to get very rich. As established earlier, the migrants were single men. First, they focused on gold, then planted tobacco under the leadership of John Rolfe, which led to lots of wealth for the colonists. Growing tobacco led to plantation-style plots, and their main source of labor was indentured servitude, which was a contract for a work period for a specific time in exchange for eventual freedom and land. But then, in 1619, African slavery gradually replaced them. Also, this area was kind of democratic as well, as they had the House of Burgesses, and it acted as a representative government, but it was only limited to the white-only, property-owning men as well. Moving all the way south to the southern Atlantic coast and the British West Indies, they had the highest concentration of enslaved labor, specifically the British West Indies. Also, as they were close to the equator, they experienced long growing seasons and most profitable sugarcane. Thus, why they had large plantations, as they had an increase for demand for sugar. So, Then, as they wanted more and more enslaved laborers from Africa, the population began to become mostly black. It was literally 4-1, making white a minority. So they passed the Barbados Slave Code out of fear, which were laws basically stripping the rights from black workers, which led to more brutal conditions for the enslaved. Then, South Carolina also low-key mirrored British West Indies, but they focused mainly on growing rice and indigo, and slavery became rooted in society. This all created a rigid social hierarchy, with at the top were wealthy white planters, and in the middle were common white planters, and then all the way at the bottom were the black population. Now, moving on to the transatlantic trade, one of the major trade systems was known as the triangular trade. Basically, New England transferred rum to the West Africa, which there rum was traded for enslaved Africans, which were transferred to the West Indies via the Middle Passage. And then the enslaved Africans were traded for sugarcane, which was transferred to New England to be distilled into rum. And then it just kept going in that triangle. So, moving on to ideologies that drove this was mercantilism, which was an economic system that emphasized a favorable balance of trade. So basically wants to max the exports while minimizing the imports, which the measure of wealth were in this time measured in gold and silver. It was also a state-driven economic system, so the government makes all the economic decisions. Basically, colonies exist just to serve imperial parents' economy, which low-key caused problems as the British tried to impose control on the colonies, which the colonies didn't like. So, since Britain saw that they were gaining too much independence, they implemented the Navigation Acts, which forced colonial economies to serve only Great Britain. So, colonies became more upset as they low-key ignored it, known as salutatory neglect. Meaning that due to a huge distance between them, first of all, Britain was already distracted with a bunch of wars with France. So enforcement was lacked, and colonists got used to ignoring these laws. Now, moving on to the American Indies and European conflict. So, an example is after the Pueblo Revolt, the Spanish eventually returned and subdued Pueblo, reestablishing control of Santa Fe. But this time they were more accommodating as they offered land grants to the Pueblo and appointed a representative to uphold Pueblo interests. And low-key they were more lenient about Pueblo belief system. And low-key they did all this just because they didn't want to get defeated again by the Pueblo. And also another example showing a different response of the conflict is Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War. Basically, Metacom, also known as King Philip, which the British called Metacom King Philip, his group attacked settlements all over New England, and they destroyed about dozens of Puritan towns, killing hundreds of colonies. Metacom eventually was captured and killed, and lots of the Wemapengong people died too. So, resisting didn't happen no longer as many of them died. Moving on to more devastating things was slavery. Basically, so in the north, not much slavery was going on, but once we started to go more south, there was much more slavery. Also, at first was the indentured servitude, but then it was African slavery. So, basically, the reason why was Bacon's rebellion in 1676, and it was led by Nathaniel Bacon, and he was leading for the poor, landless farmers who were also left out of voting. And land was very scarce at this time, as indentured servitudes, they were promised lands eventually. So, their group will launch an attack. And so, the outcome was to get rid of these issues with land and also the fear of the poor going against the rich, as the majority were poor. They made it black versus white. So, they relied further on slavery to get rid of both problems. But then, blacks started to become a majority as well. So, out of furthermore fear, they relied on the chattel slavery. Essentially, that black slaves were property, because chattel means property, and laws suppressing slaves furthermore were implemented. There were slave resistance though. For example, covert resistance and overt resistance. Covert resistance attempted to maintain their family structure and their cultural elements in secret, and they also worked slowly or broke tools. The overt resistance, an example was the Stoner Rebellion in 1739, which in South Carolina they killed any white people they found and burned their houses and barns. So, then the South Carolina militia eventually suppressed them, but this caused an effect for more fear for the owners. Thus, they implemented more severe slave codes. Now, moving on to the social and diversity aspect. First off, in the 13 colonies, there was a bunch of diversity. Germans, Irish, other European groups, and Africans. Also, what led to unity was the Great Awakening, the first one, because there's more like in the curriculum later. So the first Great Awakening. Basically, Christianity has been declining for centuries prior, but then starting in the 1730s, preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield encouraged listeners from all backgrounds to respond to God with emotional and as individuals, which affected everyone, which created a shared identity and belief system. Also, the Enlightenment, writers like Jean Jacques Rousseau and John Locke, which promoted ideas of natural rights and social contract. So, these ideas of individualism and rights started to represent more democratic movements in the colonies. Also occurrent was the Anglicization, which means English or British. Basically, by the end of the period, there was signs of American colonies resembling British culture, which is low-key weird because they left British for religious freedom, but now they're like it's almost the same. But examples which are like social hierarchy, and many people grew landless and poor. Also, by the end of this period, many colonies shared a basic government structure, a governor, legislative body divided into two houses, which was the same structure in England, but those who appointed the governor and legislative body were different. Now we'll be talking about tensions that are rising to, set us up for the next unit. So, land became very scarce, so they wanted more land, so they want to go west into the Ohio River Valley. But the indigenous were there, and also the French, their alliances and stuff, they were over there. So if they went in, there'd be conflict. Also, British colonists felt independent and had a sense of, natural rights. But Britain was trying to control them. And, they didn't like that. The colonies didn't like that. Also, due to the Navigation Acts, which means that they could only trade with the British. The colonies wanted to trade with more other markets. They had lots of exports. So some began to smuggle goods to other markets. But, tensions were rising. So we'll be talking about that in the next unit. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.
Like and subscribe and comment.